Hello, welcome to Jewish Museum Milwaukee. My name is Ellie Gettinger, and I'm the Education Director here, and I am excited to be joined today by Dr. Richard Kane. As we're talking today, we're going to be exploring the Civil War. And we're exploring the Civil War because this is Memorial Day next Monday. It's Memorial Day next Monday. We want an opportunity to reflect on the experiences of Jewish people in the military. And a lot of times I think we spend time thinking about World War II and World War I to some extent, and Vietnam and all of these wars, and recognizing that Memorial Day is a more modern invention. But we also want to reflect on the experiences of Jews in the Civil War, which, as Dr. Kane will share with us, is kind of a problematic point of history to actually delve deeply into. So I am thrilled to be joined by Dr. Kane, who is a medical doctor, and after he retired, started getting into this process of researching Jewish Civil War soldiers, particularly from Wisconsin. Tell us what led you to this journey, and what are the challenges you faced as you're researching Jewish veterans of the Civil War?
Okay, well, thank you for having me. I've always been interested in reading about the Civil War, and when I heard the Civil War Museum opened in Kenosha, I would travel down there to hear talks, and I was also interested in Jewish activities during the Civil War, so it was kind of all came together. I liked doing research, and I thought, well, here's a research project I could do. I first thought was to look up all the Jewish soldiers in the Midwest until I realized how daunting that would have been for one person. So I just said, well, maybe Wisconsin will be enough. And so I have settled down to looking for Civil War soldiers with Jewish heritage. Now, I say with Jewish heritage because some of them, well, they all have an ancestor who was Jewish, a father or a grandmother, somebody like that. Not all of them practiced Judaism. Most of them started out that way. Some of them converted. I have a couple who never practiced Judaism. They weren't brought up that way, but they had a Jewish grandfather. So I include them as having Jewish heritage.
So and when we were talking before, you mentioned this guy, Simon Wolf, who starts a process of creating a list in the 1890s. How does Wolf's work and your work intersect?
Well, I started out with his list. He listed some 350 soldiers who were Jewish from Wisconsin. Well, that's a pretty steep number if you consider in one estimate there were only 1,600 Jews in Wisconsin in 1860, maybe 2,000 by the end of the war. Well, 350 would have been a humongous percentage of that population and just not realistic. I just did some simple mathematics looking at percentage of soldiers to the total population. And it seems like out of 1,600 to 2,000 Jewish people, there should have been about 100 to 110 Jewish soldiers from Wisconsin.
So you've identified about 27 of them.
That's correct.
And in starting to kind of develop their bios, what are the things that you found that are interesting about these people in their service?
In their backgrounds, you mean?
Yeah.
Okay, well, most of them came from German-speaking countries. What can I say? Prussia, 9 of them. Bavaria, 1. Bohemia, which is current-day Czech Republic, but it's a German-speaking area. It's the area that Hitler went after because they were German speakers. 6 from there. There was 1 from France, but that was from Strasbourg. But if you know your geography, it's right on the border between Germany and France.
Again, probably a German speaker.
And probably a German speaker. 1 from Holland. A couple from England, but I was able to trace their ancestry back to Eastern Europe.
So again, probably German speakers as well.
Correct. Or Yiddish. Yeah.
Yeah. In thinking about this grouping of people, some of them are active in their Jewish practice, some of them are not.
Right.
The ones who are active in their Jewish practice, is there any room for that within the service at that time, or is this pretty covert?
No, they had chaplains. At first, there was a law which said to be a chaplain in the U.S. Army, you had to be, what's the word, not certified.
Ordained?
Yeah, ordained in a Christian faith.
Mm.
And there was a problem with that, obviously. In the eastern United States, I think New York or Pennsylvania, there was actually a rabbi who was acting as a chaplain until somebody came to visit the troops from a Christian organization and saw that he wasn't ordained in the Christian faith. And rather than creating a stink, he resigned.
Oh.
But somebody complained to Lincoln, who then took it to Congress, and Congress then passed a law which said they just had to be ordained in any faith, not necessarily Christian faith.
I would have thought it would have gone through the courts that, that this is about a separation of church and state, but no, it was an act of Congress.
Yeah, they weren't as picky about that separation for the most part back then. As you know, they had all sorts of prayers in school and everything else.
Right.
But it went through Congress. That was actually the quickest way, especially knowing that Lincoln was behind it.
And so some people chose to have kind of a more visible Judaism. When we were talking before, you said that a lot of people kind of kept whatever Jewish heritage they had hidden.
Yeah, it depends what unit you were in. There was one unit in Illinois which the vast members were Jewish. I forgot the number of the regiment. There were a couple in New York which were almost entirely Jewish. They would have been wide open in their practices. But if you have one Jew amongst a company of 200 people, and some of those people might be anti-Semitic, he might just be quiet about his background. So it depends, where they were serving.
In terms of kind of your research and what you've discovered, are there stories that you are particularly enamored with of the soldiers in their service or where they served? What are your favorite stories to share?
Well, one the two who did not practice Judaism were fascinating because their grandfather was David Isaacs, who was a Jewish merchant in Charlottesville, Virginia. And he had a common law marriage with a free colored woman of color. Her name was Nancy West. They had 7 children together. They've got a fascinating story in themselves. I don't have time for that. But one of their daughters, Julia Ann Isaacs, ended up marrying a fellow by the name of Eston Hemmings. Now, you may recognize the last name Hemmings.
I do recognize the last name Hemmings. I'm guessing he is related to Sally Hemings, who is famously Thomas Jefferson.
He was the youngest son of Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings.
Oh.
And what's fascinating about him is he got his freedom when Jefferson died. It was in his will. He was born a slave because his mother was a slave.
Right.
He stayed in Virginia until his mother died. Then he moved to Ohio for about 12 years. But he was very close to the border when they passed the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. He didn't feel comfortable with his family, even though they were very white looking. Because you have to remember, Sally Hemings was 3/4 white. And her children with Thomas Jefferson would have been 7/8 white.
Right.
Now, his wife, Julia Ann Isaacs Hemings, had African blood in her. So their children were a little more than 7/8. But nevertheless, they were pretty white looking and they could pass, but they still felt uncomfortable because they were living in a community of color in Chillicothe, Ohio. So in 1852, he up and packed and moved, didn't tell anyone where, but he ended up in Madison, Wisconsin, and changed his last name to Jefferson. He didn't have any qualms about being related to Jefferson. And two of his children ended up fighting for Wisconsin in the Civil War.
Interesting. That is a fascinating story, and I think one that most people are not aware of.
No, and I do have a talk that I give on both Sally Hemings and Thomas Jefferson, how their relationship began, and some of the interesting things about it. And I have another talk on Jefferson's Wisconsin connection, where I talk about the biographies of Eston and his children and their participation.
After the war, did they come back to Wisconsin? Did these two men survive?
And they survived. They also had a sister whose husband fought. He survived. But their sister died at age 29, I think, of tuberculosis. I found her obituary in a Wisconsin newspaper, and it said she died of a wasting disease just like her mother did. So that tells me the most common wasting disease back then was TB. So anyways, yes, they both survived. Beverly Jefferson, that's a guy, went to Madison, traded, swapped motels for hotels for a while, and then went into the transport business of human transport, like taxi cabs except horse-drawn. And he had the largest transport service in Madison for 4 decades. It was called the Beverly Jefferson Transport Service. And
so that was one of the things we were talking about. You said a number of the gentlemen that you researched became successful. So yeah. So what are some of those post-war success stories? And were they assisted by the fact that they served in the Civil War? Or was that kind of just like one stop on an otherwise long career?
Yeah, it's hard to say how much the Civil War, it's hard to say how much that influenced them. I would imagine probably gave them a lot of confidence to have gone through that kind of ordeal. Couple of them, here's one by the name of Adolf Nathan. He grew up in Prussia, immigrated to New Orleans, eventually went to Chicago and graduated, spent some time at the Bryant and Strassen Business College. Then he went to Lancaster, Wisconsin. Now that's in Grant County, which is way in the southwestern part of the state, right near Dubuque, Iowa.
I was about to say basically Iowa.
Okay, except it is Wisconsin.
Okay.
And he joined his father's business there, and they sold farm implements and livestock. And I came up with this number in a magazine. It was a huge success. They were making $300,000 a year as a family.
After the Civil War.
After the Civil War in the 1870s. $300,000 a year is multi-millions today.
Yeah.
It was a humongous amount of money. Well, he eventually took his money, resigned from the company, and moved to Chicago. He started another business in Chicago. That was very successful for a decade. And then he retired, but he didn't stop there. After his retirement, he became director on the board of directors of a lot of different companies. He was in charge of the committee, which was in charge of finance for the Columbian Exposition in Chicago. He was very involved in the temple in Chicago, and he died in 1923.
So he is someone who not only maintained his Jewish practice, he actually was observant throughout his whole life. And
That's correct.
Did, as we're kind of wrapping things up, were any of these people, did you ever find, and I know this is one of these things we think about a lot now, the trauma of war, the PTSD that people must have experienced. Do any of them in their bios reflect anything on those challenges?
Yeah, I had one fellow, if I can find his name. Give me 1 second here. If I can't find his name, I'll just tell you about him.
Tell me about him. Don't worry about his name.
Okay.
We'll correct
He ended up going to Chicago. He was a successful businessman, but when I found his obituary, he had died of an opium overdose. And it said due to the pains he suffered, which he acquired as a result of fighting in the war, being wounded in the war. Now, this was in the 1890s. He overdosed on opium. And I'm thinking, what's happening today in our country? There's an opium epidemic, toxicity. And so it was going on there. I've come across 2 or 3 other soldiers, not Jewish, but I've come across 2 or 3 other soldiers who also took their lives with overdosing of opium.
I think that's one of the things we always have to consider as we're thinking about Memorial Day and those who died in service, but also those who come back and they have all of these challenges that, we can't possibly imagine as people who haven't been in war. So it's interesting to note that even 160 years ago, that was an issue as well, that this wasn't a quick fix. The war is over. Everybody should just be fine.
Yeah, they didn't have the potent drugs they had then, but they had what was called laudanum.
Yeah.
And that was basically tincture of opium, and you could overdose on it.
Well, it has been such a pleasure talking with you today, Richard. Thank you so much for sharing with us. If any of you, this is just whetting the appetite. As you can tell, Dr. Kane has so much information, so feel free to contact me. I can get you in touch with Dr. Kane. He has many lectures available, and we are delighted that you could share with us today.
Okay, thank you. You're welcome.
And as always, I have to thank our sponsor, Robin Cohen, for her support of Museum Moments. And tune in next week when we talk to Rabbi Dina Feingold about becoming the first woman rabbi ordained in Wisconsin. Pretty exciting stuff. Thanks so much and enjoy this long weekend. I know it's only Tuesday, but it'll be here soon.